I don't remember seeing Back to the Future for the first time, but I do remember being instantly obsessed with it. Not only is it a fun adventure, but the time travel element almost forces you to think about story structure. In what order do the events happen? Can they be changed? This last question is more for Back to the Future 2, and we will definitely come back to that later. Since I watched Back to the Future for the first time as a child, I've always been drawn to stories with an element of time travel in them, because I'm interested to see how the time travel plays out, how it's used to tell or enhance the story. In that sense, it's almost like a clockmaker taking apart a clock or a watch to see how it works. It's the one science fiction / fantasy trope that is extremely good at exposing story structure. But because time travel stories play with story logic, they can be both fun and mind-blowing, but they can also be a clusterfuck and a mess.
I don't want to talk about time travel, because if we start talking about it, then we're going to be here all day talking about it, making diagrams with straws.
Before we can talk about fictional time travel, we have to talk about time. And yes, that can also become very confusing as well. I apologize in advance. Events can have A or B time properties. I wrote most of this script in December, on December 9th. December 9th is today, but by the time I'm recording this, or you're watching it, December 9th is not today anymore. It's yesterday or last week or last month or even last year. That's an A property. A properties are always a matter of perspective and can change through the natural flow of time. Time travel stories usually mess with B properties instead. A B property is when something happened in relation to another event. Like for instance, I was born after the fall of the Berlin Wall. This is not something that is ever going to change in my real life, but it could be changed, debatably, in time travel stories. I say debatably because, as we'll see soon, it depends on the story if anything can even be changed. To talk about time travel, we have to decide on a definition that works for narrative structure, because unfortunately there are a lot of different ways to interpret both time and the possibility of time travel. It all depends on which field of study you're coming from and which theory you find most compelling. Einstein's theory of relativity, for instance, states that time is relative and that there's no absolute external time. To talk about time travel in stories, however, it might be more useful to look at what philosophy has to say about it. Because for a story, it doesn't matter if the time travel can actually happen, it matters if there's some internal logic in the story world. According to philosopher David Lewis, time travel can be defined as the difference between personal time and external time. A character is time traveling if there's a difference between their timeline and the timeline the other characters in the story experience. In this way, the character's time travel experience is similar to the audience's plot experience. If you're watching a movie, you're watching the events of the story reordered in the form of a plot. Sometimes you see the events of the story in chronological order, but likely not in real time. Sometimes something is skipped, kept from you, or you get to see something that happened earlier in the story. Adding time travel to that mess means the audience has to be even more active in making a mental map of the chronological events of the story. Not every time travel story uses time travel in the same way. Do the characters travel completely in their own mind, or does their body travel with them? Is the time travel forward or backwards? And maybe most importantly, can the timeline be changed? Mental time travel is used in movies like Arrival and The Butterfly Effect. The characters don't go anywhere physically. The time travel is triggered through a memory that they discover they can influence, usually because they accidentally did something different than the first time. In The Butterfly Effect, Ashton Kutcher's character Evan doesn't actually remember what happened originally. He has blacked it out. The audience hasn't seen the events either, so when we first get to see those flashbacks, like Evan, you assume this is what always happened. It's only when he wakes up from the memory and his life has been changed that he realizes he can change the past. This movie is a good example of the mental trap you can fall into when thinking too deeply about time travel movies. Early on in the movie, 7-year-old Evan has to make a drawing that shows what he wants to be when he grows up. His teacher calls his mom to show her the drawing because he drew a man standing over 2 dead bodies. The teacher is super concerned, not just about the contents of the drawing, but also because Evan doesn't remember making the drawing. And this is the catalyst of the entire story. It's the reason he starts seeing a psychiatrist who tells him to keep journals, the journals that he later uses to travel through time to the blacked out memories. The reason why this scene is so confusing is because adult Evan makes his drawing when he's in prison in another timeline after killing his girlfriend's brother Tommy. The reason why he travels back in time to that particular memory is because his access to his journals is limited in prison. Also because he thinks of a way to make his religious cellmate help him by creating stigmata on his hands. Except whoops, shouldn't those have been there the whole time for people around him, you know, like the drawing? Them appearing out of thin air for his cellmate suggests he remembers the other timeline where Evan didn't have those things since he was 6, but still went to prison, which doesn't exist. On the other hand of the spectrum, we have physical time travel. Physical time travel is more common in time travel fiction, and it's also more deliberate. It usually requires characters being frozen in place to skip a chunk of time, or some sort of time machine to travel through time. Traveling through space isn't necessary for time travel, but it does often happen because not moving through space can create a pretty big paradox. In H.G. Wells' novel The Time Machine, the character sits in his time machine while the external world moves quickly around him.
That makes a hell of a cappuccino.
This is a fine way to travel forward in time. It's not much different from the normal flow of time or being cryogenically frozen in a pod for 200 years. The problem comes, as all things in time travel fiction, when you travel backwards. The time machine never moved in space, so moving backwards in time means that it collides with itself. This is called the double occupancy paradox. This is a paradox Back to the Future fixed by having a time machine that has to travel through space as well, lowering the chance it crashes into itself at any point in time. Of course, that movie, my favorite movie, also causes a million other paradoxes, but I'll come back to that later. The biggest difference between forward and backwards time travel is that forward time travel can and has happened in the real world. Relativity and time dilation can cause an astronaut that's been in space for 10 years to come back to Earth and find that more than 10 years have passed. An extreme version of this kind of time travel can be seen in Interstellar, where Murph ends up being older than her own space-traveling father. Backwards time travel isn't possible in real life, or at least we haven't seen evidence of it. And the big question for fictional time travel is, can it change the past or not? In the first Back to the Future, it looks like the timeline is mutable. When Marty accidentally prevents his parents from meeting, his siblings start fading from a picture. He later starts fading himself, but his parents kissing brings him back to life and restores the future. This implies that the future is kind of set from that point on. Like there was only one event that leads to the rest of their life. Basically like a happily ever after in a fairy tale. The ending of the movie also suggests that this Marty, the Marty we've been following from the beginning of the story, belongs in this new changed timeline. There is no other timeline. Because otherwise, where is the Marty that always had successful parents? That is something that is of course addressed in Rick and Morty when they travel to another timeline because they Cronenberg their own timeline. In the second Back to the Future movie, Doc Brown seems to imply the existence of the multiverse. Instead of there being one true timeline, Biff giving the sports almanac to his past self creates an alternate 1985. The characters can't travel back to the future from this alternate point because it would be a future based on this reality. When Marty comes home to Biff Tower, Biff seems surprised because that universe's Marty was supposed to be in Switzerland.
You're supposed to be in Switzerland, you little son of a bitch!
So I guess the timeline in Back to the Future doesn't actually change either. It's a multiverse. But that doesn't explain what happened to the Marty that belonged to the successful parents in timeline of the first movie. On the other hand, the existence of one mutable timeline means that the alternate 1985 Marty was in Switzerland, but then he vanished out of existence as soon as the other Marty appeared on the timeline. Which I guess we know is also not possible because not running into yourself is a whole plot point in the second movie. Look, I've been thinking about this for the past 25 years or so, and I'm still not sure if the characters can actually change the timeline or not. If a character can change the timeline or not can potentially cause all kinds of story problems and paradoxes, but it also impacts the meaning of the story. The Back to the Future series heavily leans into personal freedom and how the future isn't written.
It means your future hasn't been written yet. No one's has. Your future is whatever you make it.
The funniest unintentional example of that is that the actress playing Jennifer was changed between movies 1 and 2. This, by the way, also isn't Crispin Glover. That's why he's upside down. And the future truly wasn't written when these movies were made, because if it was, we'd be watching Eric Stoltz. Or maybe his replacement was always in the cards, who knows. Stories with a fixed timeline often include causal loops or predestination paradoxes, like the movie Predestination. They have a lot in common with Greek myths like Oedipus because they're often about how attempts to change fate actually sets that fate in motion. I won't spend too much time on time loops because I think that could be a whole separate video. But when it comes to Greek-style tragedies and time loops, I do want to mention Elsinore, a game where you play as Ophelia in Shakespeare's Hamlet. Except you're stuck in a time loop, and every time you die or after 4 days of game time, the loop resets. Unlike the actual play, playing as Ophelia, you actually have some agency and you can try to save everyone. It's never permanent, however, and you're cursed to start over and over. I guess that's the true fate of Ophelia. Causing the exact thing you're trying to prevent is a common trope in time travel fiction. Because a lot of time travel fiction is ultimately about fixing the past, common story beats include killing baby Hitler, saving John F. Kennedy. In the Twilight episode Cradle of Darkness, the protagonist goes back in time from some dystopian timeline to kill baby Hitler. She becomes his nanny, kidnaps him, and then jumps into the river with him. Another housemaid discovers this, sees it happening, and buys a baby from a woman on the street to replace Hitler. His father notices this and is heavily implied that this sets him on the path to evil and destruction. This is a form of the predestination paradox. Congratulations, you just caused the very thing you were trying to prevent. And if you're still alive, you're now stuck in a loop with another version of yourself going over and over and over. Time travel, of course, has a few more famous paradoxes, like the grandfather paradox. It is based on the idea that you can't travel back in time to kill your grandfather because that's a self-defeating act. Logic says that killing your grandfather as a young man means you erase yourself from the timeline. But even if that doesn't happen, being successful means you have erased the whole reason to travel back in time. In a one-timeline situation, this means that you're preventing an event in the past, also means you never have a reason to travel from the future backwards to prevent it. Another common paradox is the bootstrapping or ontological paradox. This usually deals with objects not having a point of origin, like Evan's drawing in The Butterfly Effect or Lucy's journal in Timeless. The whole plot of the series starts with and revolves around protagonist Flynn stealing a time machine to change the past and future. He's using a journal written by Lucy to stay 2 steps ahead of Lucy, except Lucy hasn't written the journal yet. It's later revealed that future Lucy gives the journal to Flynn and herself, but the journal, the driver of the events in the series, seemingly has no origin. Similarly, the origin of characters can also be an endless loop of I am my own grandfather. Beyond the paradoxes, which can be fun and interesting to think about, time travel can also be used as a crutch by writers who've written themselves into a corner. Co-writer Christopher Marcus of Avengers Endgame said that time travel is insane, but it's also a good option to basically hit the undo button on all the bad things that happened in Avengers Infinity War. Using time travel basically as a Deus Ex Machina get-out-of-jail-free card makes sense in some situations, but it can break the story and be very frustrating if it wasn't already part of the story in some way. I guess in Avengers they get around that because they have Ant-Man. Another common problem with time travel stories can be the death of stakes. No stakes means the story becomes uninteresting because stories are all about conflict and stakes. If there are no consequences, if nothing matters, a story isn't going to have any tension or be satisfying. Why should I care about the problem in this scene if I know they can travel back and just press the undo button? This is the reason why a lot of time travel stories hammer home that the time machine only has fuel for 1 trip, or it needs a bolt of lightning to hit the machine, or it uses some other limited resource like the journals in The Butterfly Effect, or how repeated use of the time machine can be bad for your health, like in The Butterfly Effect. Like how in The Butterfly Effect, Evan is literally frying his own brain with his attempts to change the past. I guess technically he's overwriting so many memories onto his brain that he has the brain of an elderly man and something neuroscience, Alzheimer's. I'm gonna need a neuroscientist to explain to me what that means and if it makes sense. Personally, I didn't really like how Avengers Endgame emphasizes they only have a limited amount of Pym particles to travel through time, only to later conveniently remember another time where Hank Pym and the particles were around and you can just pick up some extra particles there. Okay, this consequences violation is justified by it being a multiverse story and also being part of a predestined timeline, because otherwise, why not repeat that trick to save certain characters? The movie and its creators generally also kind of feels like they hate time travel.
Are you seriously telling me that your plan to save the universe is based on Back to the Future?
But had no choice to use it because they fully wrote themselves into a corner when they killed all those new characters in Infinity War. Time travel can be messy, and talking about it can be very confusing. But good time travel stories do exist. For first-time viewers, Arrival hides its time travel narrative behind film language. The opening scenes where we see Louise and her daughter look like flashbacks, events that took place before the start of the aliens arriving on Earth plot. We interpret Louise's apparent sadness at the start of the story as a result of her daughter's death. As Louise learns the alien language, we discover these scenes were actually glimpses into her future. This makes her decision to still have her daughter powerful because it shows the character and the movie believe life is more about the journey than the destination, or the arrival. She won't be able to save her daughter, but she values every moment she does get to spend with her. Time travel stories that call more attention to themselves, especially if they involve a lot of backwards time travel, have to make sure they are at least consistent to their own internal logic. Backwards time travel doesn't exist in the real world, so while some stories are more plausible than others, a paradox can only really ruin a story if it's not true to the logic of the narrative world. Like not being consistent about when something has been there all along, butterfly effect. Or, you know, maybe time travel is always a mess and I just love thinking about puzzles that can't be solved while making diagrams with straws. I hope I give you something to think about, and as always, thanks for watching.